All right. So, Erin and John, we have the pleasure of the two of you kicking off the first session of a 3-day program that the amazing students in this room will be experiencing to learn the ins and outs of policy around the environment, national security, and the economy. All of our sessions are moderated by students themselves from the group. So, while I've had the pleasure to correspond some with you over email, you're not going to be seeing or hearing much from me right now. I'm going to turn it over to one of our participants, Nadia. Nadia, feel free to introduce yourself very briefly, your own academic program and focus in this area briefly. And then we look forward to hearing about John and Erin's background from you. Nadia?
Great. Well, good morning, Erin and John. It's really nice to have you here. My name is Nadia Cedaram. I'm a PhD candidate at FIU. I study climate migration and climate mobility. My program is within Earth System Science, so in relation to rising sea levels. So I am going to read the bios that I was presented with, and then I have a few questions for you, and then I'm going to open up the room to questions to the larger group. When you ask a question, please always also remember to introduce yourself as well so that our guests know who you are. Okay. Well, today we have the pleasure of meeting both John Conger and Erin Sikorsky. I hope I said both of your names correctly. John Conger is the director of the Center for Climate and Security, where he oversees all of the center's programs and chair of the Climate and Security Advisory Group. He is also a senior advisor to the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Mr. Conger previously served as Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense at the U.S. Department of Defense, where he advised the Secretary of Defense on all budgetary and financial matters. Prior to his service as Deputy Controller, Mr. Conger oversaw energy, installations, and and environmental policy throughout DoD in 3 different positions. And before DoD, he served for 12 years on legislative staffs in the U.S. Congress, including as professional staff for the House International Relations Committee. Mr. Conger holds a BS and an MS in Aeronautics and Astronautics from MIT and an MA in Science, Technology, and Public Policy from George Washington University. Thank you again for being here. And as for Ms. Erin Sikorsky, she is the Deputy Director of the Center for Climate and Security and the Director of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Previously, she served as the Deputy Director of the Strategic Futures Group on the National Intelligence Council in the U.S., where she co-authored the Quadrennial Global Trends Report and led the U.S. Intelligence Committee's Environmental and Security Analysis. She is also the founding chair of the Climate Security Advisory Council, a congressionally mandated group designed to facilitate coordination between the intelligence community and U.S. government scientific agencies. Ms. Sikorsky worked in the U.S. intelligence community for over a decade. Prior to joining the NIC, she led teams covering a range of issues related to the Middle East and Africa. Ms. Sikorsky earned a Master's of International Affairs at Columbia University and a BA in Government from Smith College. Again, thank you both for being here. Very impressive resumes. So I'm going to ask kick us off with a question, and then again for the rest of the students, please use the raise hand function if you at any point if you have a question, and I'll start that facilitation. But my first question to either John or Erin, I'd like you to maybe tell us a little bit about how climate and national security are connected. What issue areas do you tend to find yourself dedicating much of your time to?
Why don't I go first, and then Erin can go, because I think this is the overarching question, right? Climate change is often thought of as an environmental issue. But I think it's important to recognize that climate change is changing the entire world, and therefore it's going to affect all issues. And so it's not just an environmental issue, it's an economic issue, it's a healthcare issue, and yes, it's a national security issue. When you're dealing with security interests that are global in nature, and climate change is changing dynamics around the world, you're going to have all of those interests be affected in various ways, depending on what part of the world you're in and what you're actually trying to accomplish. And so, from a department, excuse me, from a Department of Defense perspective, which is where I spent a lot of my career, you have physical impacts to infrastructure and to training and to readiness. You have impacts as far as new missions. What are you going to do when all of the Arctic ice melts and you have a whole new ocean to patrol? That kind of question. And then you have the geopolitical interests and the impacts on stability from food and water insecurity, from migration, and just the larger stresses that impact stability. So in all of those pieces, climate change affects national security. Let me turn it over to Erin to layer more detail onto that.
Sure. Thanks, John. And thanks, Nadia, for having us. It's really nice to be here virtually with all of you. And I'm sorry you're not in Washington today. It's a beautiful day here. But yeah, John really, I mean, gave the broad overview, right, of the intersection of climate and national security. And what I would just build on top of that, right, is generally speaking, national security is everything that keeps America and her interests at home and abroad safe and secure, right? And so we have a bunch of tools in our toolbox that help us do that. And I would say climate security is about protecting those tools from the impact of climate change, but also preventing other risks and threats and managing other risks and threats around the globe that might emerge because of climate change. You know, a very traditional conception of national security is really usually focused on states, right? Other states and what they can do to the United States or our interests and allies and partners abroad. But that definition has expanded over in recent years, and there's been a lot of discussion. It's not just states, right? First, there was the discussion around non-state actors and terrorists post 9/11. Now that discussion is expanding even further to think about non-traditional actorless, quote unquote, actorless threats, whether it's a COVID-19 pandemic, as we've seen over the past year, posing a real threat to US security interests, but also things like climate change. And you might hear the terms human security or natural security thrown into the mix. And from my perspective, from the broadest perch, those are part and parcel of national security interests, whether it's the Defense Department and its concerns, but also the State Department, the intelligence community, Homeland Security, USAID. It's a whole bunch of different pieces of the puzzle here in terms of the intersection of the risks. And the last thing I'll say is that I think it's important to recognize that when it comes to climate change, it's really about, I'd say, connected or networked risks, right? It's never just one thing. It's often how these things intersect with one another. So when you're looking at, say, the question of competition with China, you also have to think about how does climate change play a role in that relationship? How does it drive Chinese behavior, for example? How does it shape what China's most concerned about in its backyard? And so you layer climate on top of a lot of other things that we're already concerned about. So it's not, John often says this, it's the wrong question to say, is climate change or China a more important or more concerning threat to the United States? It's how do those two things intersect and overlap? So I'll stop there, but I'm really looking forward to your questions and the rest of the discussion today.
Yes, thank you so much, both Erin and John. Wow, that's a lot of different issue areas that you covered there, from geopolitics, new oceans, food security, states. Yeah, this is a very wide-ranging set of issue areas, so thank you. So John, this next question is directly for you. Much of your career has focused on finance and budgets. What are the budgetary needs and impacts as it relates to the US being able to effectively address the climate issues impacting national security?
So thanks for the question. Yeah, I spent a lot of my career on Capitol Hill, where I dealt with appropriations and budgets and defense budgets in that context. And then when I came over to the Pentagon, even when I was doing installations and environment, a lot of your job focuses on building the budget each year and doing oversight on the execution of that budget. And then finally, I ended up as the deputy comptroller. So I had the whole budget that I was looking at and helping to build. So in all those contexts, obviously every factor affects budget. And there's an old saying in Washington that strategy without budget is hallucination. And so in that context, you actually have to have the resources to back up whatever you're intending to do. I would say this, that a lot of the attention to climate change in recent years, in particular on Capitol Hill, was galvanized by the imposition of cost from extreme weather events. When Hurricane Michael destroyed pretty much Tyndall Air Force Base in the Panhandle of Florida, that cost to rebuild, to recover, came to it was on the order of $5 billion with a B. And so when Congress has to write a check for $5 billion, that gets their attention. And not long away from that, there was another hurricane. I think it was actually a little bit before Hurricane Michael, was Hurricane Florence, which came to Camp Lejeune on the coast of North Carolina. And that wasn't a high wind storm, but it was a high water storm, lots of precipitation, over 2 feet of precipitation. And so in that context, the damage and the cost was over $3.5 billion. So each time one of these events occurs and Congress has to write a big check, that gets everybody's attention. And it has helped to do a couple of things. One, it has helped to get everybody comfortable with the idea of dealing with climate change because it's having current impacts as opposed to projected impacts. People are often more likely to debate what is going to come rather than what has already happened. And so recovery costs, reaction costs, adaptation costs, these are the things that are immediate term and are the bills that we're having to pay with regard to climate change right now. Some of the things that we would do, I call the zero cost decisions that you have to incorporate climate into. And I'll give one example for that. In Nebraska, at a place called Offutt Air Force Base, there was a headquarters building for Strategic Command, the U.S. Strategic Command, which oversees nuclear weapons posture and a whole bunch of other things. It was a huge building that they were going to build, and it was about $1 billion building. They made a zero cost decision to build it on a higher ground rather than in the floodplain. When they made that zero cost decision, they were able to avoid future costs because it just so happened that a few years later, there was a huge flood that took out about a third of the base. And because they built that new building at a higher elevation, they avoided the costs that are associated with the flooding. And so a lot of the things that you're going to be doing are the zero cost decisions, but they're the ones that take climate change and climate risk into account in order to avoid future costs. So by appropriate planning, and you know, I'm telling you that there are some places where it's not going to cost you anything extra. You're just going to have to make smart decisions. A similar thing is, you know, when you buy a new car, do you buy the hybrid or the electric, or do you buy the old, you know, internal combustion engine car? Those are decisions the Department of Defense is poised to make now because they're going to be switching over to electric. That choice isn't necessarily going to cost them a lot extra. The choice that the reason that'll cost them money is they're going to have to build some charging infrastructure. So there are some accommodating infrastructure costs that are going to be associated with a lower carbon footprint. But a lot of the lower carbon footprint stuff is going to be about, you know, what choices you make with the resources you already have, and it's not going to be about new resources. But there is going to be some important investments in resilience, you know, when that storm comes next time. And I look at it this way: if a big hurricane is going to cost $5 billion when it hits a big base, how can you make sure that the next time that same hurricane hits that same base, it costs 10% as much? What do you have to do different? How do you have to lay out the base differently? What kind of infrastructure do you need at the base to do that differently? I'll give you one other cost and then I'll stop talking. When instability is allowed to sort of devolve and turns into conflict, and instability doesn't always turn into conflict. Not every climate stress turns into conflict, but when it does, and we have to deploy forces, that costs a lot of money. And the Syrian civil war is the example and point. The climate change did not cause the Syrian civil war, but when you already had hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Iraq war inside Syria, and then you have a multi-year record drought that takes basically all of the farmland and makes it useless, and it can't grow crops, all of those farmers and agricultural workers move to the cities as well. So you have hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people, economically displaced people driven by climate impacts. And it just creates the conditions for tension in those environments where you have a lot more people than jobs and a lot more people than housing. And so in that context, because that did devolve into civil war, and because there were a whole host of other reasons, the United States had to deploy military forces to the region and to that particular location, that imposed costs. That's not the kind of thing you budget for. That's the kind of thing you react to. A lot of this is the kind of thing you react to. The things you budget for now are in reducing, in providing yourself the capability to reduce those impacts in the future, to prepare. And there's a variety of things one could do in that space. And I'll stop talking there.
No, John, that was wonderful. I think you gave some really amazing insight for me in particular, when we think about what's going on here in Miami, where people have been sort of at least trying to push policymakers into preventing further development in very high risk coastal areas. I think you gave some really amazing insight into what are the types of decisions, cost benefit analyses are kind of ongoing in those types of, in those decisions. So thank you. My next question is for you, Erin. Much of your career has focused on the intelligence community. Many of our students are interested in careers in this community. What role does intelligence play in all of this?
Sure, that's a great question. I think, at its core, the U.S. intelligence community, the goal, right, is to help the president and the government make sense of the world, right? Understand how all the different pieces fit together and shape that landscape in which the U.S. is operating. The goal can be to provide the president and other policymakers decision advantage, right, in making decisions, but also to provide warning of risks coming at the United States. And in both of those cases, the issue of climate change must be considered. And, you look at the intelligence community traditionally, it's been very focused on secrets, right? Gathering secrets as a way to provide decision advantage or warn of things. But more and more, it's about taking secrets and marrying that with open information, or even in some cases, given the world we live in today, just taking a lot of open information and making sense of it for policymakers, right? And as climate change becomes more and more of a concern, it has to be part of the conversation within the intelligence community at various levels, looking at all sorts of risks, whether they're the direct risks that John mentioned, or the more indirect risks of the Syrian civil war. Again, is a great example of where the U.S. intelligence community can play a role in helping policymakers understand how conflicts and instability might develop in certain places, right? It's one thing now to take that example and look back and look at how drought played a role in driving that instability. It's another thing to be able to look forward. And fortunately, when it comes to climate change, we actually have fairly good predictive models and predictive capabilities that we can integrate into intelligence work to help us when we're saying, okay, looking down the road, where do we expect state instability? Where do we expect conflict? What might we do to prepare for that if it were to happen? That there's climate information you can integrate into that kind of analysis that can be useful to policymakers going forward. And I think that's a key place where you see the intersection of climate and intelligence that is starting to expand ever more, I would say, within the government. My background is not a climate background. I come from a security background, but when I was leading those teams looking at the Middle East and Africa, looking at things like ISIS or looking at al-Shabaab in Somalia, or even bad governance in Kenya, time and again, you saw that climate impacts were coming up and influencing the shape of things on the ground, right? And I realized that it was something that the intelligence community needed to spend more time focusing on, and not just focusing on in separate teams that were only looking at climate change, right? But that was well integrated across all the agencies. And I think, again, it's not something that's completely new to the intelligence community. They've worked on it for quite a while, but it's becoming, it needs to become more and more of a focus across different agencies. And there are some examples that folks can look at that are public if they're interested in seeing how the various agencies deal with climate change. There's a memo, a white paper that came out in 2016 that was written as really kind of the definitive look at climate change and how it affects national security, that was put out by the National Intelligence Council. There's also the annual threat assessment each year, which the DNI provides to Congress, laying out key threats and risks to the United States, and climate has been a part of that for many years now. And there's also a product that I worked on that is actually coming out this week, so I would encourage you to keep an eye on it. It's called Global Trends. It comes out every 4 years, and that looks out 20 years at key trends and uncertainties that will shape the national security landscape, and climate has been a big piece of that many times over, and will be in this one as well. So it's just a factor that absolutely must be considered when you do intelligence work, because otherwise you're going to miss things. And going forward, because of those predictive capabilities that are out there, it's actually something, unlike predicting what, I don't know, Putin's going to do 5 years from now, right? Who wants to take that bet? But predicting what sea level rise is going to be like 5 years from now, you have pretty good models that'll tell you based on how much warming is in the world. And so as an intelligence professional, I would love to be able to use, you wouldn't want to not take that opportunity to use that information.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erin. So I have 2 questions, sort of kind of as follow-ups to one another. So you both reference, climate change being considered this sort of threat multiplier in many ways. And so I was wondering, again, because you're both sort of describing wide areas of issue here, you're trying to see the connections between them, assess the role of intelligence, and sort of seeing those roles before they even, so those trends before they even play out. I wanted to kind of understand, what is the role of communications in your organization in being able to communicate that research and sort of advocate for action on this issue? But also, are there any scenarios or challenges that you foresee being of particular concern for the US in the future, probably referencing some of the findings in the Global Trends report?
Why don't I start with the communications part, and I'll hand it over to Erin to talk about the scenarios. So communications is a lot of what we do at the Center for Climate and Security. And I want to point to one thing that Erin just said that is worth emphasizing. She talked about she had a security background, not a climate background. Our organization is a security organization that deals with an environmental issue, is not an environmental organization that deals with a security issue. The distinction being, we all have security backgrounds, we don't have climate backgrounds. So we're all looking at how this external factor impacts us, and I think that's really important. It's also important on the communications front. What we have found, and we do a lot of educating of Capitol Hill and policymakers. What we find is that people are much more willing to listen to somebody with a security background when they're skeptical of the issue in the first place. And so when you go and talk to, let's just say climate skeptics on Capitol Hill, who tend to be a little more conservative, they are much more willing to trust the viewpoint of a retired general or admiral who is affiliated with our organization than they might with somebody who comes from an environmental advocacy organization, because they sort of write off the environmental views as consistent with stuff they've already heard, but the military views are interesting and different, and they are consistent with their previous advocacy for protecting the military. And so in that context, when we bring in this climate threat to the military or to the security environment, it is an important communications tool that we use, and that is a large part of our organization, because it crystallizes people's views to the implications of climate change in a way that sometimes they hadn't thought about. What we've also found is that this enables us to talk about climate security as a bipartisan issue, as a nonpartisan issue. And so we have had a wide amount of both Democrat and Republican support in Washington for protecting national security from the implications of climate change. But in that context, so I guess the answer to your question is communications is very important, and the messenger is as important as the message. And so I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind, and it is a large part of how we operate. Erin, did you want to talk about the scenarios?
Sure. And I would just throw 3 other quick points in on the communications. I think on climate security risks generally, when you look at the academic literature on it, there's still a lot of debate, right, about how much does climate change exactly impact conflict and what percentage and all of that, which is really important. And I'm glad there are academics out there that are doing that. I think from our perspective for communications, we try not to get lost in those weedy debates around what percentage and all of that, because I think that misses the broader point that it does contribute at some level, and we need to understand that. The 2 other quick points, one I would make is that just because we identify climate change as a national security risk, that doesn't mean all the solutions then are national security or defense based in particular, which I think is an important message. So we're not about militarizing climate change or militarizing the response to climate change, right? Those 2 things are separate. And then around the topic you work on, Nadia, I think another communications issue is around climate migration issues, and making sure that when we talk about it as a security risk, we're not talking about the people themselves as a security risk to the United States, for example, right? But you talk about it in a more nuanced way, how climate puts a risk on those people and then drives behavior depending on what else is going on in their country. So those are just a few other things in the communications mix that I would highlight as we talk about this issue. On the scenarios piece, I mean, there's a lot of different directions you could take that question. So the thing I think about, the 2 things I would say. One is we're seeing more and more that what was once considered the worst case scenarios for climate effects are actually probably the more likely case when you look at some recent research around sea level rise, for example, or temperature warming. So I think that's important in a national security context for planning, to make sure that you're actually looking at some of those worst cases and thinking about what preparations you might need to make to manage those. Another issue in terms of scenarios, I think, or one scenario that I'm most concerned about, I guess I would say, is places like South Asia, or where you have this overlay of geopolitical challenges, say between China and India, or between Pakistan and India, and then you overlay climate risks on top of that, say with shared water basins in those regions and the rivers. And those are the types of scenarios that I'm most worried about from a geopolitical national security standpoint, because I think climate change has a real chance of making those situations much worse. And it's not something that has been looked at quite as much as, say, how climate is driving conflict in the Sahel in West Africa, which is also important, but perhaps less concerning on a broad geopolitical level. But happy to go in other directions if people have different questions.
No, thank you so
much.
much.
Can I just add one point onto what Erin just said? I think it's important to recognize that as we think about scenarios, there's a lot of climate impact that is locked in. For the next couple of decades, the changes that we're going to experience are going to be based on emissions we've already put into the atmosphere. You're not going to change those. And so preparing for the impacts of the next couple of decades is important. The things we do to change our emissions profile are going to change the world after 2050. And that's going to be important too, by all means, because things could get really catastrophic. And there's plenty of catastrophes we have coming forward. But even going to zero emissions globally, we've still bought a lot of risk and a lot of terrible things that are going to happen that we have to prepare for in the coming couple of decades.
Thank you so much. I just have one follow-up to either of you on this point, and then I'll pass to Sarai for a question. So you, Erin, you spoke about, again, this, raging academic debate between like contribution, attribution. There's all these uncertainties inherent in in determining, to what extent climate plays a role in some of these issues. Do you ever find that uncertainty, that the inability to sort of make those attributions, does that ever make it harder to sort of get your message across?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it can if you don't manage it in the right way, right? And I think that's why I think we try to avoid some of that academic debate, because I think then you get the broader point gets lost. And I think the good news is I think more and more the attribution and the understanding is growing, right? And things are getting better all the time in terms of being able to do that. And I think you gotta make sure, we have to make sure that we're not over selling or over dramatizing the links, right? And that's why we never say anything like climate change causes conflict or climate change causes instability. You got to show how it intersects and how it networks. And I think one of the ways we've tried to do that within the Center for Climate and Security is we're part of a broader organization, and we have something called the Converging Risks Lab, which is a part of our organization that looks specifically at how different risks like climate and say nuclear issues, or climate and conflict, or climate and ecological environmental degradation issues intersect, and building that research into the program. But I think you're right. You have to be cautious to make sure you're not overselling, but I don't know that. I think as long as you're careful in your communications, you can avoid problems there.
And let me add one additional point in that context. There was a debate in Washington over the last 20 years over whether climate change was real, right? And you had non-scientists arguing with non-scientists about very complicated climate issues that neither one of them understood. And so just because somebody found a chart someplace that some think tank gave them, doesn't mean that they have suddenly come up with a revelation that the entire scientific community missed. So these political debates about very complicated issues are usually not very useful. And it's kind of like the trust level that cigarettes cause cancer. There was a sort of tobacco industry funded debate over that for a long time, but when all the doctors agree, people have generally accepted it. Well, the climate dynamics are similar. We've had very complicated debates about this for a long time, and you had very clear evidence that of climate change. Those academic debates we avoid. We don't get into the science. We say, look, this is our security experts have conveyed their collective wisdom to these points, and that's what we're hanging our hat on. And so we are able to avoid a lot of those academic or scientific or other debates, and just say, look, we're relying on the expertise of these people who spent their careers in the security field, and they've made these observations, and that's very helpful, and it's hard to argue with.
Wonderful. Thank you both for those insights. Sarai, you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Nadia. Hi, my name is Sarai Leon. I am a senior at FIU studying international relations. And thank you so much, Erin and John, for being here. I'm really enjoying the discussion. So I guess it's something that John touched upon twice. My question has kind of evolved as the discussion continues. So it's basically about partisan lines and how different politicians, whether that be on the Hill or in the executive branch, kind of deal with this issue of national security as it intersects with climate change. So you discuss how, and I find this really interesting, how presenting it in a security issue area makes it so that they pay more attention to climate issues. But I find that really interesting because I think as citizens, from the media representation that we get, a lot of the times we see climate change as a partisan issue from the politicians themselves. You mentioned the discussion whether climate change was even real for the last like 2 decades and things like that. But I wanted to push more on how you approach politicians that might be hesitant to deal with the issue of climate change, whether it be because they have other interests or they prioritize the economy or small business or whatever reason. So exactly like how do you present the information on how climate change intersects with national security? Is it like more of a local approach? Do you discuss foreign policy? What really makes them, like, other than just generally security, what makes them really pay attention to how national security intersects with climate change? Thank you.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So I've spent a lot of time working, I worked on Capitol Hill for a long time. I like to say that I'm bilingual. I speak Democrat and Republican. I can have good conversations with each. And I think it's important to recognize that people in Washington don't change their minds. So absorb that for a second. Nobody in Washington ever changes their mind. What you have to do is take the new issue and tell them how it's consistent with what they already believe. And so when we bring climate change to someone and say, I'm not telling you you have to change your position on taxes or your spending or any of that stuff. All I'm asking is that you listen when military voices say that this affects their job and their ability to do their job. And that can be compelling. And what we have found is that it becomes a bipartisan issue in that context. And people come to the issue for different reasons, but generally people are accepting of that piece of the puzzle. And what we've also found over time is that the argument over the science, even though the news reporters look for disagreement, that's fine. But the fact of the matter is that over time, the general acceptance of climate change, that climate change is happening, is man-made, it has become more widespread. Then they argue about what to do about it. And that is a way more healthy and constructive conversation, even if there's similar polarization over that. Because once you accept the common set of facts, then you can talk about what everybody should do. That's just more helpful in general. But talking to, I think it's just when you're talking to a politician, when you're talking to people with different political stripes or whatever it happens to be, don't start by telling them they're wrong. You have to start by telling them why they're right and why what you want is consistent with what they believe. And you have to be able to find that space. And then help them explore it. I'll talk to people in one party or another, and it's not, neither party's uniform either. Everybody has different local interests. I generally say that all climate change impacts that people care about are local impacts. Whether you've got flooding in your backyard or wildfires in your backyard or whatever it happens to be, you care about what affects you. And the more things that affect you, the more relevant it is. And so you focus on those, and people will be more receptive to that, and they'll adopt different pieces of the puzzle as their own. So I would say it's not one answer, but you find what they're interested in and find how it connects to that.
Just to build on that real quick, I think, John's commentary about, it affects every district and every region differently. I think I've seen that in action. And just a quick anecdote, when I was still, before I came to the Center for Climate and Security, I was still in the National Intelligence Council. I went down to testify before a subcommittee on the Hill. And I'm from Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin. And there was a member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress from Wisconsin on the committee. And he gave this introduction soliloquy about climate change based on his hunting practices in Wisconsin and what he was seeing in terms of ticks, bugs in Wisconsin, and how it affected hunting, and how he had recognized that climate change was affecting this. And I think, frankly, for better or for worse, because climate effects are so much more tangible now on a regular basis in so many parts of the country, you have more and more members of Congress that are realizing, however that effect manifests in their district, in their backyards, they're seeing it and they can't wish it away. And so finding those connections, I think, is going to be ever more possible, frankly, just because the effects are here.
Thank you both so much for that. Jonathan, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. My name is Jonathan Ramirez. I'm a student of the Master of Arts in Global Affairs, and thank you, Erin and John, for being here. I have a question. It's more related with probably the global vision, and it's based on two articles that I read on the Center for Climate Change and Security. One of them is that the comparison of the national security strategy between Obama, Trump, and then Biden. And the second part, the article of climate security plan for America. And my question is, do you think that organizations as, for example, NATO, that were basically created based on security, should start adopt new perspectives, should start adopt new ways to understand that climate change also is going to affect on the long term, and that at the end of the day, we have to change from that perspective, realistic perspective of national defense, and start like looking for more cooperation globally wise? Do you think that's something that needs to be done?
That's a good question, and good for you for checking out our website ahead of time. I'm impressed. Let me talk about NATO just real briefly, because I think it's really interesting. Actually, NATO itself has been putting climate change front and center in its security work for quite some time now, under the leadership of the current Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who used to be a climate negotiator, right? And just earlier this month, when they had a foreign ministers meeting in Brussels that the U.S. went to, the NATO agreed to some strategy on adopting climate security precepts into its work. And so I think they recognize that climate plays a role in shaping the threats to Europe and to the alliance, and that it's something that they're going to have to manage and deal with. And I'm not sure, I'm not an IR theorist, but I would argue that even if you are a realist, you might still think that climate change is an important issue to tackle because it affects your national security. Obviously, the solutions, right, and who you work with might depend there on your perspective, but it's something that NATO is already tackling and already looking at. Whether it means more humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions that they're going to have to put money and effort into, whether it means instability in parts of the world that might lead to more migration to Europe that they'll have to manage. And then, of course, the Arctic is a huge issue for them as well, and how Russia and China are operating there and attempting to take advantage of melting ice and making it a more competitive place. So all of those are on the table for NATO, and I think as they think about collective defense going forward and what that looks like, climate change is a key piece of it.
I think Erin covered that really well. Let me add one more thought. When you think about what NATO needs to think about, or what any sort of security strategy needs to be focused on, it is critical that you focus on the correct conjunction. What I mean by that is it is not or, it is not this or that, it's and. It is not, climate change does not replace the other security threats. It is not something that you displace the other considerations for. It layers on top of them and affects them and drives them. So ultimately, let's take the Arctic example for a quick second. When the Arctic ice melts and Russia changes its position of its forces to project more power over the Arctic, the security threat is the Russians changing their forces, is not the ice melted, but the ice melting prompted that. And so you have to be able to understand climate change in order to understand the other security threats that you already would have been thinking about. So it is an important part of the calculation, and an increasingly more significant variable as you think about this whole equation. And so if you ignore it, you do so at your peril, and you're going to get caught blindsided. So you have to layer it in.
Although I will say, if the ice melts in the Arctic, we have bigger problems to worry about globally than whether Russia has boats up there or not. But I mean, it is important. But I think the geopolitical side too. Sometimes I worry, and I do it myself, right? But just to be frank with you all, sometimes I think that we focus too much on the geopolitical. It's really good for the messaging, but also we might miss some of the forest for the trees.
Absolutely. Thank you both for adding so much richness to this conversation. At this point, I want to just again remind you all, if you have any questions, please use the hand raise function in the chat. And I, all of the, again, thank you for just all of what you've added today to this conversation and drawing on all your experience. I've been thinking a little bit. I have a question marinating. It's not fully formed, so I'm sorry if I'm butchering this a little bit. But I was having this conversation with a researcher from the Netherlands once, and he just thought it was so fascinating. I think it reflects one of John's earlier points, that we have all these, multi-billion-dollar disasters, and they keep, with Hurricane Michael, with Hurricane Florence, Sandy, Katrina, all of these disasters that require so much federal expenditure in disaster relief afterwards. He found it to be so strange that with all this money needing to, that the Congress would need to appropriate, that we didn't just find a better solution instead of just constantly writing checks after every disaster. Because he was from the Netherlands, and whenever they had one major, well, they've had several major floods, but they had this one sort of event in the 50s that caused them to reimagine their entire country with the Delta Works project. And so I guess my question to you all, and again, not fully marinated, is, is this just going to keep continuing? Are we just going to keep writing check after every disaster, or is there something, some event, some kind of reflecting on what John said, that no one in Washington changes their mind? Is there ever going to be a point where we really take a more holistic approach to this, which is, again, getting to these greenhouse gas emissions?
Kind of. I mean, let me throw in some. The Netherlands has an advantage the United States doesn't have, which is a difference in scale. If the U.S. is going to invest in resilience across its entirety, that's a lot more space and a lot more to do, and so it's not so easy to come up with that investment. People see a disaster tangibly after the fact and can spend money on it. It is harder to justify preventative action. And all too often even set climate change aside, in Washington, money is spent on response, not on prevention. It's just the mentality. And it's the way the electoral system sort of drives people. And it's a shame, but it happens. And that's true in any enterprise. So if you look at defense infrastructure, which I happen to know a little bit about, there is a backlog of maintenance in Department of Defense facilities that exceeds $100 billion. They simply work that hasn't been done. And when has implications, but the point is that there's not going to be the will. There's not the will to do that. There's not going to be the will to do some of these other pieces too. So take into account in Washington and broadly, that scale is intimidating, and so it does inhibit a more comprehensive preventative response. Occasionally, you do come up with something that changes the whole system. That can happen, but it tends not to be based on sort of preventative, responsible action more than catalyzing some sort of new innovation that takes over the conversation. Erin, did you want to add something?
Sure. I just add a few things. I mean, on the scale side, I think one of the other challenges the United States faces is that the climate change effects manifest differently in different geographies. So you've got the storms on the Gulf Coast, you got the fires in California, you've got agriculture issues elsewhere. So it's hard for the government to conceive kind of as one overarching, right, response and getting everyone moving in the same same direction. A second thing is just a recommendation. There's a reporter from the New York Times, Chris Flavelle, who's been doing a ton of work on adaptation in the US and FEMA in particular. And his writing, I would really encourage you to read it if you're interested in this, because he really unpacks some of these issues in the US and around environmental justice as well. And how do you encourage people not to keep building in the same location, even if they're going to get hit again and again? And then the third thing I would say is I do think I think when it comes to climate security, and John mentioned this earlier, we really try and emphasize, there's the adaptation and resilience for the near-term threats, and then there's the emissions cuts for the long-term threats, and you need both, right? And I do think there's an effort within the government, and we'll see how successful it is, but the executive order from President Biden on tackling climate change pushed at this to kind of break down some of those silos to make sure you're building a more comprehensive preventative response in the security space in particular, by asking the Pentagon to do a risk assessment that's supposed to look out and be integrated into wargaming and other things. So to build kind of that mentality and that skill set around what you're talking about, Nadia, but I think it's a cultural thing. It's hard to change. John says no one ever changes their minds. I don't know if I'm quite that cynical yet, but give me a few more years. I think there are efforts afoot, and hopefully you all will be part of that effort going forward. But yeah, I think as John says, it's super hard. Some of it's just the nature of the country itself and the geography.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for humoring me with that question. So another question. What internship and early career opportunities exist at your organization, and what career advice do you have for our students?
We definitely have internships. So if folks are interested, that's something you can always reach out to us about. We also run a climate security fellowship program, which we've run two cohorts of so far. And the third cohort, we will be putting out a call for that soon. We delayed it with COVID and wanted to wait until we could have a chance of getting some folks together in person again with this next cohort. But that's not a full-time gig. It's just a part-time piece to kind of get some mentorship and experience on the issue. So those are two things we have. In terms of career advice, my main advice to people is do something you're really interested in, you're passionate about, and that is the best way to find something that fits well for you. If you told me 10 years ago that this is what I'd be doing now, I wouldn't have believed you. I was, focused on East Africa and terrorism, and that was going to be the thing I did for, the rest of my life. And that's not where I am now. So, but I found new things that challenged and interested me. I would also say, I'll stop there. I'll let John give his advice.
So I think you covered the internship part. I don't need to add to that. I'll throw one piece of career advice out there. And something that worked for me, which is when I was in my early 20s and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go, I sort of looked at the leadership of the Department of Defense and said, all right, how does one get one of those jobs? So what I did was I said, oh, what were they doing when they were my age? And so I, the full nerd that I am, pulled down everybody's bio, made a chart of what they were doing when they were 25 years old, and looked at the data. And what I found in that particular situation was the largest number were in the military, and the second largest number were on Capitol Hill at that age. And so I decided I was going to go work on Capitol Hill because that would be the most fruitful route to get to where I wanted to go. It was useful for me. I'm not saying it's useful for everybody else, but it was broadly, it gave me help in picking a direction more generally. The path I went on was not the one I expected. So, it's not necessarily the sort of, best way to map out exactly what you want to do, but it gave me a general way forward.
Yeah, thank you both. John, I think that's amazing advice. I learned that one a little bit late, but I do that now when I see someone with a position that I think of as a dream job. I take a look at like what their resume has been like. So we have 6 minutes left in this session. So if anyone has any remaining thoughts, again, oh, we got 2 questions. So I'll just pass it to Carlos, and then Vanessa, you will close us out.
Hi, my name is Carlos. I'm here, a physics student here at FIU. And I just had a question for John. I know you mentioned the idea of like zero cost solutions. And I just wanted to ask, what do you believe are like zero cost solutions that have yet to be implemented?
So so not all of the zero cost solutions are zero cost. Some are just minimal cost, but planning is always important. I think there's a lot of planning that needs to be done, and that's generally relatively low cost. It is important not to get lost in the jumping to the answer when you haven't thought it through yet. Ready, aim, fire is always better than ready, fire, aim. And so that's one piece of it. I think in the resilience space, building codes are important, because when you're in a hole, you should stop digging. So continuing to debate what's going wrong and continuing to operate in the same old way is a surefire way to make the problem worse. Don't try and get the optimal solution right at the beginning. Stop making it worse first, because that will build over time. If you put in something that saves you, I don't know, 3% of your problem now, while you're trying to get the 100% solution, but then you argue about it for 15 years, you're halfway there. So as it accumulates over time. So I would offer both of those. So building codes are a good example of, stop doing it wrong, and then we'll figure about fixing the stuff that's already in place. That kind of thing is important in an adaptation perspective. Erin?
I think you got it.
Awesome. Thank you, Carlos. Vanessa, I think you wanted to ask a question, but you might be frozen. Do you think you could just unmute yourself? And okay, cool.
Hi, good morning, John and Erin. It's nice to meet you both, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to meet with us. My name is Vanessa, and I'm an undergraduate student at Florida International University studying environmental studies. My question to both of you is, in terms of addressing climate change, do you think that Congress needs to be asking for more money to address the climate crisis, or do you think it's more of a matter of knowing how to spend the funds that are already available? And so sorry for having my camera off. It's just my connection is unstable right now.
No problem. I think more money is always better. And I think this is a crisis where you're going to need more money, but you do need to put it in the right places as well. And you can find ways to put money in the right places, depending on the project and the issue that you're working on, to have more of an impact. But I do think to truly address climate issues overall, yeah, you're going to need more money.
I agree. You need both. By all means, make the zero cost adjustments. Where you need the most money is not even in the security space. I'm gonna go on a slight tangent, but we can't make so if you look at the global emissions, China is twice the United States. India is rapidly catching up. The three of us, make up about half the world's emissions. If you really want to change the world, you can't make China change its behavior. You can't make India change its behavior, even if you could regulate the US down to zero. The solution here is to give everybody better choices. And in order to give everybody better choices, you're going to have to innovate. You're going to have to invent it. And we have seen that when you dump a ton of money, a ridiculous amount of money into innovation programs, you get really impressive and earth-changing innovations. Probably the single best thing that we can do is not to go after and change and regulate and tax and do all those things. It's to put money into R&D now, so that in 30 years we'll have the solution to the larger problem. To put just billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars into R&D in the front end is going to be the best spent dollars of all of the ones that we're talking about right now. I'll close with that.
John, I think that was the perfect way to wrap up this session. So thank you very much. John, Erin, again, just thank you so much for your time, for drawing on your experiences, for just answering all of our questions. This has been an absolutely fascinating session. I will pass it back to Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. I'll give my own thanks to John and Erin on behalf of FIU, and also thank you, Nadia, for being a fantastic moderator that I'm glad that our future moderators throughout the 3 days had as an example. So thank you as well. This was a fantastic opening to the program. John and Erin, nice to meet you, and we do appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And thanks for the great questions. It was a good discussion, and feel free to follow up, at least with me through Eric, if you'd like, if you want more information about the fellows program or other things.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks, much appreciated.
Hello, Commissioner Streitfeld. I will be the one introducing you to our group today. My name is Shireen Yamud, and I am a master's student getting my master's in international studies with a focus on security, and I have a background in environmental science and veterinary medicine. So today I would like to introduce our second speaker for today. Born and raised in South Florida, Commissioner Rachel Schoefeld grew up in a household where civic engagement was a strong theme. Serving from a young age as a student body president and women's soccer captain at Plantation High School, her love of public service brought her to Washington, D.C., where she majored in Middle Eastern Studies at George Washington University, including studying Arabic and spending a semester living in Cairo. Commissioner Streitfeld worked for the office of Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, whose district at the time included North Bay Village, and is now an attorney practicing law in the areas of land use, zoning, the environment, and local government, as well as climate adaptation. She runs her own law firm, Brightside Legal, and is a part-time associate at the firm of Erin L.D.D. She is a diehard Miami Heat fan and a certified scuba diver. Welcome, Commissioner Streitfeld.
Thank you, Shireen. It's really great to be here, everyone. That was a quick bio. I did prepare a slideshow to just guide our conversation, but the environment is our economy here in South Florida and in North Bay Village, where I'm a local elected official. We are literally surrounded by Biscayne Bay. When I go through the presentation, I'll show you an aerial map of North Bay Village so you can get a clear idea of exactly how surrounded by Biscayne Bay we are. But it really is the most important thing for not just our quality of life, but for the jobs and the future of our economy. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now, and we will get started. Just real quick, here is, there. So just a little bit, to go over my background and give you a little bit more of a clear sense of sort of where I'm coming from. I'm born and raised in South Florida. I grew up in Broward County and Plantation. I went to public school. I went to Plantation High, graduated in 2003. My dad was a judge in Broward and my mom was an editor at the Miami Herald. So, in my bio, when it says I was raised in a household where civic engagement was really a strong theme, I mean, my parents read Carl Hyacин's column in the Miami Herald, and I feel like I am a better public servant today because my parents read Carl Hyacin and discussed his column at the dinner table and at the breakfast table. And if I didn't follow current events, I was basically going to have like nothing to talk to my parents about. So I did go to GW. I moved to DC in the fall of 2003. I majored in Middle Eastern Studies and Political Science at the Elliott School. And I started interning for Debbie when I was 20 years old. She was newly elected to Congress. There was no one in her office. We had a staff assistant, maybe one legislative assistant, Chief of staff was in transition. I mean, it was like a bare bones congressional office, and I was there from ground zero, helping her establish all of her systems. And it's really ironic. Debbie swore me in when I was elected here in North Bay Village. She remains like a sister to me. To say mentor is like not even the full picture. Her mom passed away on Friday. I don't know if the FIU folks, if you all knew about that, but Debbie lost her mom on Friday. So as soon as I am done here, I'm going to the Zoom funeral and then to spend the afternoon sitting Shiva with her and her family. When I was in Debbie's office as her staff assistant, I got, I interned there and then immediately was hired to be her staff assistant after graduation. So I was, by senior year, I was set. I had my job lined up as of February that year. And one of the biggest things that I learned in Debbie's office was how important the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Project is to South Florida, and how appropriations can funnel money to much needed local infrastructure projects. And all of that education that I got from, making sure the trains ran on time in Debbie's very, very busy office, it all carries to today, where I am, representing a local government, and we need billions of dollars for infrastructure. And so understanding the process, the federal appropriations process and the policymaking process for authorization of certain environmental policies, it continues to yield benefits in what I do today. I left Debbie's office in the summer of 2008. I did a stint on the Obama campaign. I worked in Florida State headquarters. After we won, I moved back to DC and I became a lobbyist for an advocacy organization called J Street. You guys are in DC. You may be familiar with Aipac, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. J Street is a more progressive pro-Israel lobbying organization, and they were brand new. So I was a lobbyist lobbying for a two-state solution. And then I moved back to South Florida in 2012 and became a regional political director for that organization. So building capacity in South Florida. My region included North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama. So I was all over the place building capacity for J Street. I left and went to law school in 2013. I got my JD from UM in 2016. And then I worked at a very small boutique land use litigation firm called Shubin and Bass, where I was really fortunate to work on really exciting projects: the expansion of the Ransom Everglades School, the expansion of the Bal Harbor Shops, the demolition of the Sears at the Aventura Mall, and the subsequent redevelopment of a beautiful new shopping plaza. Interestingly, in the Aventura Mall, but the shopping plaza is owned by a completely different set of property developers and owners. So you can imagine there was a little bit of tension between the owners of the mall and the owners of our development. I left Shubin and Bass in 2018 and I started my own firm, Brightside Legal, and I do land use and zoning. My clients are property owners who need something from the city, whether it's a variance for their side setbacks or their site plan or a waiver to be able to use the property for something that is not prescribed in the zoning code. I have, a single family homeowner who wants to develop a home on a lot that's too small. I mean, these are all sort of just real property land use related issues. But on the side, I do a significant amount of work for Erin L. and she is both an environmental lawyer. She's also a certified planner. And in Florida, we have a growing industry around climate change adaptation, as you probably know already. And local governments like North Bay Village or Miami-Dade County or Monroe County in the Keys are really trying to figure out how to update their infrastructure, whether it's raising roads or managing stormwater differently. There's millions and millions of dollars out there right now for local governments to establish vulnerability analyses and sustainability plans. And that is a lot of the work that I do with Erin. And as an elected official in a tiny island community, you can see how all of that knowledge really helps me in a bunch of different areas of my work and my life. And then, yeah, I was elected to the commission here in North Bay Village in November. So I've lived here for about 3.5 years, and I saw very quickly that there was not a lot of skill on our commission, and decided to run for office after being involved in the Sustainability and Resilience Task Force for 2 years. And I did not draw an opponent and was elected unopposed in November. So that's it for background. Now for the real substance. So the idea of the environment as our economy in Florida is not a new concept. Florida's history and the entire history of South Florida is reliant on economic development in the face of challenging environmental scenarios. So the Florida Everglades was obviously the Everglades up until significant federal investment came in the early 1920s to dredge the Everglades. Different Florida businessmen and governors and policymakers had attempted to dredge the Everglades really from the mid-1850s all the way up to the 20s, but it wasn't until the federal government really bought into the idea of draining the Everglades, and the Army Corps of Engineers made a significant investment by dredging all of these canals and building all of this infrastructure. So what's interesting and important about that is that we now have a continuing maintenance and operations obligation on the part of the federal government to South Florida. The Army Corps of Engineers, I mean, you can see the historic flows of water from, the lakes region in Kissimmee around Orlando down into Lake Okeechobee, and then the sheet flows from Lake Okeechobee that came down through the Everglades and fed fresh water into the Everglades ecosystems. Well, now, because we've drained the Everglades, we've got all of these canals, these complicated canals and levees and ditches and dikes that pushes the water out to the Atlantic Ocean and to the bay, and through these canals. We've created a massive infrastructure challenge for ourselves today, because the Everglades is getting drier and drier, and as sea levels rise, the salinity levels in the Everglades threaten not just ecosystems. I mean, we care about the wildlife, of course we do, but they threaten our clean drinking water supply. Okay, the Biscayne Aquifer and the Florida Aquifer, these are underground networks of fresh water that we rely on for potable water. And if we don't have groundwater aquifer recharging, when it rains and water sits in the Everglades and then it percolates down into the aquifer, if we lose that system, we are going to have a potable water crisis in this region. And obviously we can't afford to let that happen. So in Florida, environmental permitting is a really big deal. And as a land use lawyer, I have to kind of emphasize that there's constantly a push and pull between development, and Florida is a very, very development friendly state, but the need to preserve our environment. I'm a big Democrat, but I will congratulate Governor Ron DeSantis all day long for his commitment, not just to comprehensive Everglades restoration, but to improving the environment and water quality in the state of Florida. So we have federal permitting requirements. We're obviously bound by the Clean Water Act, and the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System is a big program within the Clean Water Act that regulates pollutant discharge points, as well as a whole other network of pollution into the waterways. So anytime anyone is constructing anything that may impact the waters of the United States, and the definition of the waters of the United States has been changing with each president for the last 10 years, but any construction has to get an NPDES permit and has to go through permitting under the Clean Water Act, as well as the Endangered Species Act. So you all know that the manatee was an endangered species. It was downlisted or downgraded about 4 years ago. It's no longer endangered, it's threatened. And since the manatee was actually downgraded, surprise, surprise, we've seen a significant increase in manatee deaths in the last couple of years. So I think, you know, the EPA got a little bit ahead of itself when it downgraded the manatee. But there's a really interesting example of how the Endangered Species Act can really impact development, and the Florida Keys is one such example. So there are many endangered species in the Keys: the key deer, the indigo snake, and the marsh rabbit are 3 endangered species in the Keys. And because these areas are protected, the Keys has to enter into a memorandum of understanding with the federal government and with the state government about where it builds. And because of, and this is really interesting, because of hurricane evacuation route requirements in Florida law, if you have to evacuate an area and it's going to take longer than 24 hours, based on census figures and then modeling that the state runs, you have to limit development. So right now, Monroe County, even though there are thousands of undeveloped parcels of land in the Florida Keys today, because of this limitation, because of the Endangered Species Act and because of this evacuation regulation, the Florida Keys can't just issue building permits for those vacant parcels. They are allotted, you know, a certain amount of building permits, and they've been on a 10-year plan. The actual complete development of the Florida Keys was set for 2023. They just extended it to 2026, but the Keys can only give out 1,971 more building permits. Like, that's it. And there are thousands of parcels that are owned by individuals who expected to get some value out of those properties, but they, by law, cannot be developed. So the Keys has a whole bunch, they have a takings lawyer who deals specifically with these issues, because I'll imagine all of those property owners who can't develop their property are gonna sue the county and the state because they can't develop. So this is all going back to, you know, environmental consciousness and environmental regulations. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection issues environmental resource permits, and we have not updated our stormwater rules in Florida since the 1970s. I mean, imagine that. Think about how much more developed South Florida is. Think about how stormwater and climate conditions have changed over the last 50 years. So the parameters that we are looking at when we issue construction permits for highways, for malls, for major residential communities, the stormwater regulations that we're using now are the same ones basically that were written in the 80s. And we just last year, the Florida legislature passed pretty significant stormwater quality, water quality in general legislation, the Clean Waterways Act. And they, in the Clean Waterways Act, directed the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and all of the water management districts statewide. We have the South Florida Water Management District, and then there are 5 others, Southwest Florida, St. John's. All of the water management districts and our DEP are right now in this moment going through new rulemaking for stormwater in the state of Florida. They have a technical advisory committee that is meeting monthly, and that's made up of people from, you know, the developer industry, the Florida Stormwater Association, the Nature Conservancy. There are about professors, engineers. There are about 18 people on that technical advisory committee, and they are going to be meeting for the next 8 months to advise DEP and the South Florida Water Management Districts on new stormwater permitting rules. And that's going to have a serious impact, especially on local governments who are thinking about raising their roads. If you're going to raise a road to prepare for sea level rise, you have to incorporate stormwater management technology into an elevated road. Otherwise, you're throwing good money after bad and you are not addressing the problem. So as local governments think about raising their roads and we have new stormwater quality rules, it just makes it that much more expensive to complete these infrastructure projects the right way. So that's something that I'm tracking for several clients right now, but I'm also tracking it for North Bay Village. And then the last thing is in Miami-Dade County, we have DERM, the Division of Environmental Resource Management, and their mission as stated in the code for Miami-Dade County is to protect all of our natural resources, but really Johnson's seagrass. So at the bottom of Biscayne Bay, we have Johnson's seagrass. The seagrass beds have depleted 85%. Most of that depletion has happened in the last 10 years. And so DERM, they're really, really strict with permits. People complain all the time. I can't build a seawall, I can't do this, I can't build a dock because of DERM permitting. It just takes so long. And what's unfortunate about that is that DERM permitting is a significant obstacle to development, but it's also not helping protect the Johnson seagrass because we are still dealing with these significant seagrass die-offs. So all of these agencies, all of these permits, they just all come together to make the development landscape very complicated, but also it's completely intertwined with the environment. You cannot separate one from the other. And another example of this sort of tension, balancing preservation and development, is the Kendall Parkway. So if you live in West Kendall or if you live in Southwest Miami, you know Cutler Bay, Palmetto Bay, you know that traffic is a nightmare and that there's really only one way to get to downtown. And that's, you know, either taking US 1, which is horrible, or you can take the 826 to the 836 and get to downtown that way. The Kendall Parkway was an idea to extend the 836 west beyond the UDB, the urban development boundary. We have an actual line that demarcates where Miami-Dade County development stops and the Everglades begins, and you are not allowed to cross that line, right? The Kendall Parkway was going to be constructed beyond the UDB. And on this map, you can see the highway in red going through green and blue areas 6 and 7. Well, what are green and blue areas 6 and 7? That is Bird Drive Basin, where I was talking earlier about recharging our groundwater aquifers. The Bird Drive Basin is where that happens. So imagine if there were a 6-lane highway built through that Bird Drive Basin, what type of runoff and potential auto accidents and oil spills and just debris could be infiltrating the Bird Drive Basin with the construction of a highway through that area. And these are comprehensive Everglades restoration projects. I mean, the federal government has invested millions of dollars, the Florida government has invested millions of dollars, and this highway was proposed to kind of just blow right through it. So right now, this project is stalled because a group of environmental activists got involved very early. And when Miami-Dade County, the Board of County Commissioners, was approving a future land use map small scale amendment. Okay, this is like the preliminary approval that was needed to build this highway beyond the UDB. And they held a public meeting that had notice requirements under Florida's Sunshine Law. And they published a map that was, the map that they published was different than the map that they discussed at the actual meeting. And so on those grounds, the Friends of the Everglades, represented by myself and my classmate from law school and a couple of other environmental lawyers, we sued Miami-Dade County under the Florida Sunshine Act. And we said that your notice was unreasonable because you published one map and you discussed a different map, and that was misleading. And when you're talking about a project such as this, the map is the most important part of the notice. And even though you knew that the map that you published was wrong, you made no attempt to make the correction either to the public or on the record. And so far, we're winning. We beat Miami-Dade County on their motion to dismiss. The project is stalled, and I'm waiting for the county attorneys to get back to me on settling. So the environmental movement here is alive and well, and we are having actually really great success. Senator Rubio was an advocate on the team, on the environmentalist team. He actually came out publicly opposing the approval of the Kendall Parkway. And it's really, I can't say like more about how amazing it is that we partisan support on preservation of the Everglades. I mean, it's just so important. So let's go to North Bay Village. This is my little town. It's these two land masses in the middle of Biscayne Bay. Normandy Shores and Normandy Isles, that's still Miami Beach to the east. To the west, the Upper East Side is the city of Miami. And we're smack dab in the middle on the 79th Street Causeway, otherwise known as the John F. Kennedy Causeway. We are completely surrounded on all sides by Biscayne Bay. North Bay Village was man-made. It was dredged by entrepreneur Italians in like the 1940s. I mean, the same way that you would build a sandcastle on the beach is basically how they built North Bay Village, right? They just dredged up the bottom of Biscayne Bay, built seawalls, compacted all of that fill, paved over it, planted some palm trees, which are beautiful today. And now we have a city. And the village was run poorly for a very long time. Infrastructure was not invested in, projects were mismanaged. There was very little continuity of project ideas and leadership. And so today, North Bay Village, in my opinion, is the most underdeveloped location in Miami with the highest potential. We have acres and acres and acres of vacant waterfront property right in the middle of Miami and Miami Beach. So it is really exciting to be a commissioner now. We really pride ourselves for being leaders on the stewardship and preservation of Biscayne Bay for obvious reasons. And it's not just because we appreciate the views, but there are $3.3 billion in ecosystem services and goods that come from Biscayne Bay. Ecosystem services and goods, I mean, this is clean water, this is tourism dollars, this is boat charters, this is fishing charters, this is, I mean, just so many aspects of our economy are tied to Biscayne Bay, and Miami Waterkeeper and the Miami Foundation and many, 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 many other organizations have crunched the numbers, and they tell us that if we treat Biscayne Bay as an asset, this is the return on investment, $3.3 billion, and that's annually. Sea level rise is threatening the ecosystem of Biscayne Bay, right? The increased salinity is causing a loss of productivity and damage to the Johnson seagrass, to our mangroves. Mangroves don't really like salt water. So as the salt water encroaches, the mangrove habitat migrates upland. Okay, and so that changes our environment here. We have tons of septic systems that are outdated and failing. And so you can imagine how nutrient rich and disgusting the leaks from residential septic systems are. And the septic systems and the waste from fertilizer seeps into our groundwater, and then with the groundwater flows into that canal system. And then the canal system, those waters are pumped by the South Florida Water Management District into Biscayne Bay. And so there is pretty much just a constant stream of effluent running into Biscayne Bay. And this had a devastating impact on Biscayne Bay over the summer. We experienced a fish kill, where I woke up and I walked out to my balcony and it smelled like dead fish everywhere. And you could literally see them popping up, the dead, and thing was that you could see them actually gasping for air. I don't wish this on any of you, to ever watch a fish literally coming up to air, like trying to breathe. I mean, it was one of the most horrible things. So the seagrass is dying. We've got all this fertilizer, we've got all of this nutrient, and it's causing significant ecosystem collapse. Fortunately, we have a new mayor in Miami-Dade County who really is an environmentalist. Daniela Levine Cava is the real deal. She appointed a chief bay officer. We've never had a chief bay officer before. Irela Bagay is in that position and she's doing a wonderful job. And they created a watershed management board, which is something we've also never had. And watershed management board is going to be Army Corps of Engineers, Florida Department of Transportation, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, US Department of the Interior, these major agencies with tons of money. I mean, the ability to really make it rain on much needed infrastructure projects here. Those are the people who are sitting on this water management board, and there are 3 seats for local governments. And we lobbied really hard, and I'm very proud to say that North Bay Village got a seat on that watershed management board. So as soon as they convene, I will be the representative from North Bay Village sitting on that board. I'm really looking forward to that. So we had a big march and advocacy day for Biscayne Bay. We did a cleanup, we had speakers. It was, you know, all COVID friendly outside, masks required. This happened in August. And then, you know, just really quickly in our little community, we've moved very fast to sort of right the ship as far as sustainability and resiliency is concerned in North Bay Village. We passed a Florida-friendly fertilizer ordinance. We passed a plastic-free NBV. And, you know, we can't prohibit single-use plastics. The Tallahassee legislature has preempted us from being able to regulate plastics in our own community. And so we have to work on different incentive programs, and our code enforcement team is out there all the time working with our restaurants, the gas stations, and the grocery stores in our neighborhood to try to convince them, you know, to limit their plastic. Because sea level rise is a huge issue for us. We have new seawall design standards. Our seawalls, if you're going to build a new seawall in North Bay Village, it has to be, you know, 5.9 NAVD, which just in layman's terms is like really high. We have to protect our property from storm surge and sea level rise. A couple weeks ago, we approved a green building ordinance that I authored. All new development in North Bay Village will be at a LEED Silver or higher going forward. And we are about to start on stormwater master plan. We're going to do a huge inventory of our stormwater assets and then figure out what we need to do to make them resilient for sea level rise in 2060, 2075, and 2100. And that's a huge undertaking. So there's really just no end to the intersection between the environment and the economy. And I could talk about it forever. So I'll just end there. I'll take your questions. This is my email address. Please feel free to follow up. I'd be happy to talk to you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for all the information that you provided us today. So I have a couple of questions for what you have presented, and I have a couple of people that would like to ask you some questions about what you presented. So before I dive into the questions that I have, I will allow a couple of people to ask you first about what you presented, and then we can go from there. So I would ask for Andrea to ask her questions.
Hi, can you all hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Commissioner Streitfeld, first, am I pronouncing your last name correctly? Streitfeld?
Streitfeld, yeah, thank you.
Streitfeld. Okay, I'm just going to be honest with you. 2 things. This is our second presentation, and I can already tell you it's going to be my favorite. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I'm really happy I have my Google Drive organized because I'm taking a class with the FIU Honors College right now, which is all about the economic development of Miami. And I did an entire presentation on Miami's infrastructure. So I've taken like 3 pages of notes over here on everything that you've mentioned. I'm like, oh my gosh, she's covering everything that we covered in our presentation. It's really awesome to see how all of this is just organically coming together. So I wanted to thank you for that. But let me just organize this. Okay, I had a few quick questions if you don't mind. So you mentioned the street raising initiative. Was that a specific reference to Miami Beach, like the Rising Above initiative? Or is that something else that you were discussing?
Well, Miami Beach is not the only local government raising streets. People like to talk about Miami Beach because it's the most, high profile street raising because it was so problematic. They really under Mayor Levine, they didn't do as many studies or analyses as they could have, and they went ahead and they raised the streets in Sunset Harbor and on Alton and a couple other places. I think they just did a 2 feet across the board raise. They didn't study how the street raising would impact local businesses, and that was a problem for some of their property owners in Sunset Harbor. But I think the team on Miami Beach, they're learning very quickly from their mistakes. So future road raising projects are going to have an emphasis on harmonization with private property. I mean, you can't just raise a street in a neighborhood and not prepare property owners for how the water is going to flow off of that street into their property. There's a lot of coordination that needs to be done. Monroe County is raising roads and they're doing it completely differently. I work with Erin, and she is the lead consultant on the Monroe County road raising project. And they did 4 years worth of analysis of their roads. They did the Monroe County roads project. They used LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology, to evaluate all 326 miles of county owned roads in the Keys. So they analyzed all 326 miles, and then they came up with 2 sets of criteria for how they were going to prioritize roadway elevation projects. The first set of criteria was vulnerability, looking at the sea level rise projection models. You all are familiar with the South Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, right? Everybody knows that we have our 4 local governments between Monroe, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach have come together over the last 11 years to be essentially a super think tank for climate change adaptation in the region. And they published the unified sea level rise projections. So I'm using the same sea level rise projection in North Bay Village as Boca Raton, as the city of Hollywood. I mean, we're all using the same numbers, which is really great for infrastructure. But in the Keys, they overlaid the projections. And so there was, they ranked the roads for how inundated they were going to be over a set time frame. But then they actually did a criteria called criticality. What critical facilities are served by those roads? How many residential units are served by those roads? What other, utilities infrastructure? I mean, any other facet that would sort of like go toward the importance of preserving a road. And so they use these 2 sets of criteria, and they've prioritized now, I think they've worked through like a quarter of the roadways in the Keys. And now they're sort of in the design phase of these roadway elevations. And another difference between the Keys and Miami Beach, I mean, the big difference was the difference in planning and analysis. But another big difference is that in the Keys, every single roadway elevation project is going to be designed uniquely for that area. Like it will be very, very site specific. And then in North Bay Village, it's funny, because my residents have read about what's happened on Miami Beach, they assume that we're going to raise roads here in North Bay Village like tomorrow, but that's just not the way it's going to work. We're doing a stormwater master plan now so that we can follow more along the process of how the Keys did it, where we're really closely analyzing and making strategic choices about what we do and where. And then we're going to spend a ton of time having workshops and town halls and educating our residents about what to expect, because, neighbors are neighbors.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. And I know that we have 3 other people, so I'll ask this one quickly. Are you by any chance familiar with the initiative that's a partnership between the University of Miami's Masters in Sustainable Business and a bunch of other departments at UM to construct a regenerative seawall in North Bay Village?
Yeah, very well aware of that initiative.
Okay.
Yeah, Esber and Orozco. Yeah. No, I connected Esber to our city after I met him at a Compact event. And we have an MOU with Esber and his group, and they are doing amazing things. We piloted some new seawall technology already. I've got a couple of residents who are looking to rebuild their seawalls. They're going to work with to get this new seawall technology. And we're also right now going out with an RFQ or an RFP, I forget, for design and permitting of the Island Walk, which is going to be a public seawall, and we're hoping to incorporate all of the living seawall technologies into that new project.
Do you know Silvio Pupo by any chance?
I know Silvio Pupo very well.
Okay, he's my boss. That's why I asked.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We can message offline about that.
Okay, I know. I was just wondering if you were involved in it. That was my last question. And again, thank you so much. This has been beyond what my expectations were. So thank you.
Good, and I'm so happy.
Thank you, Commissioners. So I'll take one more question, and then I will ask you a follow-up question about what you have talked about today. So Maureen, would you like to ask her the second question?
Yes, thank you. So hello, Commissioner Streitfeld, and thanks for being here today. I'm actually a history major. I'm a candidate, PhD candidate in the history department, where I study horticultural and agricultural history. And I just heard that Carl Hiaasen retired from the Herald, so that's all of our loss. So many people don't realize that the Everglades is one giant filtration system that cleanses the water before it reaches any body of water, including Biscayne Bay. So you're discussing infrastructure, and I was wondering if there's any way to build some type of water processing plant that's going to replicate the action of the Everglades, because so much of the Everglades has been developed now. There's cities and towns, and the water has to run off and be filtered before it reaches bodies of water. So is there any type of plans to cleanse the water, have like a water purification system where the water can be cleansed before it's dumped into other bodies of water?
Yeah, absolutely, Maureen. Thanks for the question. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Project is not just one project, right? It is a bundle of dozens and dozens of projects that are meant to improve the overall system, including obviously the water polishing and purification aspects of the system. So there is a reservoir that is slated. I'm hoping that we're going to get funding for this reservoir in this session, actually. I mean, that would be really great, but there's a plan to build a reservoir, I think, south of Lake Okeechobee that would do an initial round of water quality polishing and water purification. I don't have all of the infrastructure projects within SERP memorized, but absolutely water polishing is a significant component of it. So whether it's through the reservoir or construction of new green infrastructure and preservation of mangrove habitat, the healthier our mangroves are, the more effectively they will polish and purify the water quality coming south from the Everglades. So we have, there are a couple of projects in Miami-Dade County along the coast, actually, where they're preserving mangrove habitat because they see it as a key final barrier before the water runs into Biscayne Bay. But I can't be more specific, Maureen. I wish I could, but I would definitely point you to the CERT projects to sort of check through them and break them down, because there really are so many of them. Some of them have already received funding appropriations, some have not. I mean, I know that there's still a bipartisan effort in Congress right now to get continued funding.
Okay, do you have any idea if Broward County is going to be doing anything with its sewer system every time it rains heavily? Fort Lauderdale, I live in Broward County, so Fort Lauderdale sewer systems, are just leaking so much sewage into the water also.
Yeah, the Chief Resilience Officer in the city of Fort Lauderdale, or is she at Broward? Yeah, the Broward County Chief Resilience Officer is Jennifer Jurado, and she comes from the city of Fort Lauderdale. And she is a water quality guru. And I know absolutely that Fort Lauderdale is trying to modernize their wastewater infrastructure, and Broward County has done a really, really good job of at least tracking their infrastructure needs and prioritizing them. So if the plan is not already like rolling, it's absolutely being discussed and they're trying to figure it out. Like, since getting involved in the sea level rise and climate change stuff, I've come to understand that Broward County really does, I mean, not that they're ahead of the game, but they're paying attention and they know that these issues are pressing and that they get more and more sort of high stakes with every day that passes. So I feel confident in what they're doing, not necessarily in the city of Fort Lauderdale, but Broward County generally. So these are issues basically that are front and center being discussed on a regular basis at the city of Fort Lauderdale and Broward County right now.
Great, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so before I continue taking questions, I would like to ask you, since you were talking about all the advocacy work that you've done, especially when it came to the highway project that you stopped with other fellow environmental lawyers, my question to you is, and as you developed your legal career, how did you come to realize that resilient land use was a specialty you wanted to pursue? And what role do various parties, from developers, homeowners, and businesses and government, etc., play in whether or not plans for land use are sustainable?
Great question. I have always been sort of a like mission specific person. Like, I didn't get a law degree to just be a lawyer. I got a law degree to, you know, very deliberately work on issues. And when I was a 1L, first year of law school, I was living on South Beach, and this was 2013. Like, this was before sea level rise was cool. And I was trying to go rollerblading, and my car was under 1.5 feet of water in the middle of like a beautiful sunny day. And I was just like, this issue is so huge, and it's just gonna get bigger and bigger and more pervasive. And here I am at the beginning of a law school career. I can decide how I want to be involved. Like, there are going to be lawyers in the room when this area figures out how it's going to adapt to sea level rise, and I want to be one of those lawyers. And I am. So I took real property, I took Florida constitutional law, I took administrative law and environmental law, but most importantly, I reached out to my network and said, who do I talk to about sea level rise and Miami? Are there any lawyers who are paying attention to this already? Because if they are, I want to talk to them. So I reached out to Debbie Wasserman Schultz's Miami director, Lori Flink, who I'm sure you guys all know, Lori. And I said, you know, who are there lawyers working on this? And she put me in touch with Wayne Pathman, who was the chair of the City of Miami Sea Level Rise Committee. And Wayne and I sat down and had lunch, and he just brain dumped. And I followed up, and I just continued networking with people who are doing this work. And when I realized like what zoning actually was and started looking at different land development regulations in Miami Beach and the city of Miami and paying attention to things, it became clear to me that this is an area of law that is robust. It's complicated, it is highly specialized. There are not a lot of zoning attorneys, and there are certainly not a lot of solo zoning attorneys. Like, zoning firms are like your Gunsters and Greenberg and Bilzen, like your big firms. So I'm doing it solo, and I'm doing it a little bit differently. And as far as the stakeholders, look, developers want to build. They want to build and they want to make money, and financing is tough to come by, and executing construction contracts and executing development is just, that's their process. Developers are not environmentalists naturally, but through organizations like ULI, the Urban Land Institute, and through the regulations set forth by the local government that developers have to comply with, this is how we get them to build more sustainably. There is a movement in Miami around sustainable development. I mean, we do have some developers who actually really care. You know, I sat down with a very significant property owner in North Bay Village just 2 weeks ago. He said, hey, wanted you to be the first to know that I've accumulated 10 contiguous waterfront acres in North Bay Village. We're going to come in with a special area plan and we want to sit down with you and talk. And that meeting was like a dream come true for me, because this developer of all of my waterfront property basically said, what do you want? And I mean, we have already set the bar very high, right? We have this new master plan that prioritizes pedestrians. So any new development is going to quadruple the size of my sidewalks, which I'm thrilled about, right? They are going to plant all these trees. They're going to have green roofs and all of this. But on top of the new master plan zoning, I wrote this sustainable building ordinance so that property owners now, except for single family homeowners, all other property owners, new development, have to get a certain amount of points to get their building permits. They can get points by going, you know, with a LEED certification. If they want to just do the LEED process, then like one and done, like you can get all your points. But if you don't want to deal with LEED and an outside certification, we have a menu of options written into our code. So if you have EV charging stations, you get a couple points. If you do a green roof, you get a couple points. If you have a rain barrel on the side of your hotel, or a series of rain barrels where you're capturing the rain and using that to irrigate all your landscaping, we're going to give you a ton of points. So it's really flexible, but it sets the bar. So any developer coming in, they can't really ask us, you know, like, hey, can we like just skip this corner, or can we like not really worry about this? We've told them this is our expectation, and they know what they're getting into. There's consistency, there's authority, and there's thought behind what we're asking them to do. And this is how we're incentivizing sustainable development. You know, the city of Miami just asks you for a bunch of money, you know, pay into the tree trust fund. There's thousands and thousands of dollars in the city of Miami tree trust fund. Like I don't know what they're doing with it. You'd have to ask the commissioners there, but it really depends on the local government and what standards they're going to set. And there are 37 different standards now for all 37 municipalities that we have in Dade County.
Thank you. And also as a follow-up, I know how difficult it is to try and get on the table with these type of people who are responsible for that. So I know that it was difficult for you to get them to actually listen to you so you can get what you want. And so my question to you is, what role does communication play for you as a commissioner and an environmental lawyer as you communicate research and or advocate for action on this issue?
Well, it's a really good question. You know, I think that communication and public education campaigns are the most important thing for changing behavior. We have to change individual behavior, right? I mean, there are people who just don't understand how destructive it is to litter. There are also people who are just rude, right? So I mean, I do think that having a cultural shift, like on a mass scale, so that there is a community sense of stewardship for our environment, like that is something that we need to have. So whether it's billboards or Instagram ads or whatever it is that we need to do, we have to be doing more than we're doing now. And in some cases, because we are preempted so aggressively in Tallahassee sometimes, education is really all we can do. So I can't tell the Speedway, the Shell, the Presidente, all of these like, you know, major bad actors on the plastic bag and plastic bottle front in North Bay Village. I can't tell them no plastic bags, but what I can do is go to their businesses or send our code enforcement director to go to their businesses, present them with a menu of alternative suppliers. You could get recycled materials here. You could get recycled bags here. These are other things that you could do to make your establishment more sustainable. But that leaves the burden on us, right? So it just comes down to how much capacity do we have? How much money do we have? How much time, talent, and treasure really do we have to push forward these initiatives? And as far as sea level rise and climate change is concerned, I mean, communicating that is an industry that is growing and growing and growing. You know, I see climate adaptation as an industry in South Florida that is just going to get bigger and bigger, and it's not going to go anywhere. So if you're in comms and marketing, there are going to be jobs for you communicating science. If you are a scientist, but you're interested in advocacy, there are jobs for you communicating on these issues. I mean, really, if you're an engineer, if you're a landscape architect, I mean, there are just so many jobs. And I see South Florida as being a hub for those jobs. You know, when that big fancy developer came and sat down and said, what do you want in North Bay Village? One thing I said was, I would like for us to have an institution. Perhaps it's University of Miami, perhaps it's FIU. But if we had an institution on North Bay Village that was a center for sea level rise adaptation, I mean, I see that as a great option to build jobs in our community and to grow, again, another employment sector that is desperately needed.
Thank you. Now take a question from Kristen.
Hello, thank you so much for your time. This has already just been such an interesting conversation and a really great presentation. So my name is Kristen. I'm a graduate student here. Actually have a background in biology, and I'm now kind of changed to a master's in geosciences. And so I've actually done sampling, field sampling for the CERT project with the last lab that I worked with. So I'm pretty familiar with that project and just water quality issues in general in South Florida. And I've been really interested in making my career more sort of oriented around addressing directly the issues that lead to, ecological, obviously issues in the water. So the industry and focusing on what we can do, on our end is kind of key. So what I was curious about, and obviously looking forward in my career, I'm trying to figure out how scientists can help these, contribute to these solutions on sort of your end and more on the economic end. So I'm curious, like in these conversations with developers and in deciding on these different criterias for sustainability, where scientists play a role, or where you would think that scientists might contribute to the conversation in a productive way, like where maybe the scientific knowledge is lacking from those conversations.
Yeah, no, Kristen, that's a great question. One of my first jobs when I was in law school is working for Laura Reynolds, and she's a scientist who got really frustrated that there didn't seem to be a place for scientists in the community conversation on the environment, and she became a lobbyist. And Laura owns her niche, there is no other scientist lobbyist, and Laura is the person that our environmental organizations go to because she explains the compelling science in layman's terms, and she can do it for policymakers who don't care and don't have time. And she does it really well. So that's not to say you have to become a lobbyist. It just means that for scientists who are interested in the issues, being mindful of how you're presenting your information and creating templates and methods and strategies for communicating scientific data in a way that is understandable and compelling, that is absolutely a way to do it. But, there are other way more technical ways to do it, right? So there's this technical advisory committee to the DEP and the water management districts and their stormwater rulemaking. There are a couple scientists on that committee, but there are also engineers. And I would say get involved in local government, right? We have scientists on the Biscayne Bay Marine Health Steering Committee, and those scientists are indispensable to the team working on Biscayne Bay water quality issues. If you are going to go work at a government agency, but you still want to have an impact and you don't want to just be like a cog in the wheel, then manage your relationships, right? Like get to know the people who make the policy decisions and who can advance certain priorities and push other priorities to the back of the list. And then get involved in local government. Like we are so lucky in North Bay Village. The chair of our Sustainability and Resilience Task Force in North Bay Village is a woman who spent 30 years working on global climate issues at the United Nations, based all over the world, and then in New York City, and then just retired to North Bay Village. I mean, we have a true powerhouse of these issues helping our teeny tiny little village, but she's the reason we have an MOU with UM. She's the reason we have an MOU with FIU. It would be horrible for me to not stay on this call that we are on Tuesday of next week, voting on a resolution to begin the process to create a marine protected area in North Bay Village so that it will be a partnership with FIU to be a citizen science lab. So shout out to FIU. I mean, it's been an amazing relationship so far. There are so many different ways to get involved, but I would say just do what feels right.
That's great advice. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll take the last question from Nadia since the time is almost up. So Nadia.
Thank you, and thank you, Commissioner, for your time. I just will try to make this very quick. I'd want to push a little bit on this idea of sustainable development, since you mentioned waterfront property, the meeting that you had with the developer. I'm wondering, are there going to be elevation requirements for new properties that are, if we're continuing to develop the waterfront? It seems okay, great.
Yeah, so let me just explain that. No, it's a good question. It's an important question. The elevations are set by FEMA and the Florida Building Code, right? So FEMA generates flood insurance rate maps, and the firm maps show where your base flood elevation has to be. So for any new development on my island, you have to be, I think, at BFE, base flood elevation, +8, okay, 8 feet. So the first habitable floor of your space has to be, you know, X feet high, which means that, you know, what are you going to do if the grade of the street is here, but you can't have a first habitable floor until like, you know, 10 feet higher. So we are actually right now working through policy choice. I would prefer if all of that space between the grade and the first habitable floor of a home or a hotel or whatever it is was open space, landscaped open space, so that it could capture stormwater and treat runoff directly. There are other people who would prefer to build on fill, which would basically create tiny hills for each single family property owner. You know, if you basically have to just build a hill and build a staircase and a driveway and do that. So this is a policy question that we're working on right now, but elevations are set by the flood insurance rate map through FEMA and the Florida Building Code, which actually requires an additional 2 feet of freeboard, which means that, you know, you can build your floor here, but there has to be 2 feet additional so that if you need to raise it, you can raise it. But that's all set again by Florida Building Code and FEMA, and we just got preliminary rate maps. They're changing for our area. They're going to be set in the next year. And interestingly, the new flood insurance rate maps were done with sea level rise in mind. But I looked at the preliminary maps for North Bay Village, and there's no change in required base flood elevation, which I think is really interesting. So there's a review and public comment, and we're going to be asking for the analysis and all of that. But yeah, you can't just build at grade anymore. Absolutely not.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for giving us a little bit more of your time. I'm sorry we went a little bit over time, but thank you so much for giving us all these information and being here with us today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I'm getting a private message from our staff at North Bay Village who's saying that I should share with you that we are hiring. We're hiring a legislative aide, a commission aide for our North Bay Village Commission. You would be working for the mayor and for myself and the other 3 commissioners. We're a great team. We're small and lean and fun, and we have a boat. And I think, Alfredo, can you send the job description to Eric so that everyone can get the commission aid? Okay, there it is. It's in the chat. This was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me. I wish you all the best of luck.
And Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner.
From myself as well, and I also wanted to shout out Alfredo for helping us put this together. Alfredo, who's not just North Bay Village staff, but FIU alumnus Alfredo, and former DC intern Alfredo from us knowing him from his work at a couple of organizations up in Washington. So Alfredo, thank you for everything. Great to see you. And Commissioner Streitfeld, thank you so much for your time and your great answers to our students' questions.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
Commissioner.
Thank you.
That was fun. I like that one a lot.